Good morning, friends. If you would, join me once again in Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, where we read, "When he," meaning Jesus, "came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, 'Lord, if you will, you can make me clean.' And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, 'I will, be clean.' And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, 'See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them.'" Now, obviously, this is the story we focused on in yesterday's sermon, and a wonderful story it is. In such a simple account, we are introduced to the humility and faith of the leper, gaining a wonderful example for ourselves of what it means to be poor in spirit. And we see the love and mercy on the part of Jesus toward this man who is so very, very broken. And of course, in that, we see the gospel message itself, that we all have a spiritual condition called sin, and that sin brings nothing but death and decay and destruction. Worst of all, we can do nothing about this condition ourselves, just like the leper could do nothing to rid himself of his leprosy. But Jesus Christ has the power to cleanse. He has the power to cleanse the leper physically from his affliction, and he has the power to cleanse us of our sin. That is the main thrust of this little 3-verse episode in the ministry of our Lord, especially as we see it directly following his authoritative preaching and teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. As the Word, he has the authority to speak, to teach and command and to make promises, and he has the power to back it up, as we see throughout the rest of chapters 8 and 9, and of course the Gospel as a whole. But even as we have that kind of recap of what the story was really about, kind of the main thrust, there are a few details that we weren't able to get to yesterday, and I want to talk about those today and tomorrow. And most notably for today at least is, why did Jesus tell this man, who's now been cleansed of his leprosy, so we can no longer refer to him as a leper, thankfully so, but why does Jesus tell him to do what he did? Because after cleansing him, Jesus instructed him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them." What an odd thing to say after miraculously cleansing this man of his leprosy. Because what, of course, would be the man's first natural reaction? To tell everyone, right? Well, yeah, of course. And yet Jesus specifically says, "See that you say nothing to anyone." At least we can assume not until after he'd gone to Jerusalem, because once he shows himself to the priest, it becomes public knowledge at that point, without any possibility of anything else happening. But in the meantime, why keep the miracle hush-hush? Well, this goes back to the idea that Matthew's trying to give us more than just these little detached episodes throughout his gospel account. You can think of it like TV shows that we grew up with, or at least the shows that I grew up with. You know, most episodes of Full House or Family Matters were completely self-contained. In the space of a half-hour program, a conflict was both presented and resolved. Everything tied up in a neat little bow, and it didn't matter if you missed last week's episode. It wouldn't have any effect on this week's episode because they were entirely separate. Sure, same characters, same settings, but the storylines didn't really ever overlap, except on those super special occasions when the episode concluded with "to be continued next week." But more and more commonly now, shows are presented in a continuous narrative where each week, there is a specific storyline that is more or less resolved in that episode, but each week builds on the week before. The show writers are careful to craft each individual episode as part of an overarching narrative, where it very much does matter whether you've seen all the episodes and seen them in the order presented, so you know what's going on in that story arc that will take the entire season to resolve. And that second way of doing things, that is more like what Matthew is doing in his gospel account. Now, do we tend to view these little episodes in isolation? Yeah, we really do. Due to time constraints of sermons and the ease of locating convenient starting and stopping points for our reading, we tend to read and study the gospel stories more like an episode of Family Matters rather than an ongoing narrative. But when we do that, we really do lose the sense of what's going on in the story as a whole from beginning to end. And what's more, since we tend to want to make sense of things, we like to know how the little details fit in and what significance they have. Well, if we then demand to make sense of all these details in the framework of each individual isolated story, we can actually come to some very poor conclusions. For instance, in this case, if we don't look outside of Matthew 8, 1-4 for an appropriate context in which to understand Jesus' instructions, if we demand to simply take Christ's words without reference to anything else, we might then assume that this is an example that we should follow. Therefore, when God blesses us and works his power in our lives, that we shouldn't tell anyone. But that would be such a very bad conclusion, because there's a particular reason on this particular occasion why Jesus instructs this man not to tell anyone. And that reason isn't obvious if you're only looking at these few verses, but it becomes actually quite clear when you take a look at the long-term story of what Jesus' ministry and purpose was. For instance, do you remember when Jesus turned the water into wine at the wedding feast of Cana? Well, his mother Mary was there, and she's the one that notified him that they were out of wine, so he needed to do something about it. Do you remember how he responded to her? He said, "Woman," which was a much more respectful term, the way he used it as what people would generally think it today. But anyway, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." That simple statement, "my hour has not yet come." Jesus came for a purpose, and that purpose was going to be accomplished on the cross. He was going to have to be arrested, beaten, tried, falsely convicted, and hung upon that shameful Roman cross to die for the sins of his people. But he had other things to do before that ultimate climax came. And the more public his teachings became, the more public his miracles became, the more he would be pushed toward that climax due to the ever-increasing jealousy and enmity of the religious leaders of the day. And it wasn't that Jesus didn't want to accomplish his mission, and so he was trying to lay low and postpone the inevitable. No, it's simply that there was a prescribed time for all of that to happen, and it wasn't yet. This is why so very often, particularly early in his ministry, we see that Jesus heals people. He does amazing things like cleanse a leper, and then he instructs those people not to tell anyone. He even forbids demons from telling people who he really was. Why? Because there was an appropriate timing for every event in his life, and certainly an appropriate time for his death and resurrection. And in the meantime, he wasn't going to let anything happen that would disrupt that timing. He didn't want to gain too much attention from the religious leaders, or from the Romans for that matter, too early. Nor did he want his followers to start demanding that he storm the palace in Jerusalem so that he could immediately be crowned as king of Israel. Because Jesus knew that that's what the people wanted, but that wasn't his actual purpose. So that's why he gave these odd instructions like he did. Now, friends, I know that this little clarification isn't likely going to have a tremendous impact on your day-to-day. But I hope it does have an impact on how you read the scriptures, in particular Matthew's gospel, because we are often forced to take each little episode in the life and ministry of Christ on its own as we read and study. But even as we do that, we can't forget that there's an overarching narrative to everything, and not only from the beginning to the end of each gospel account, but from the beginning to the end of the entire Bible. And we always need to understand each individual piece in light of that overarching whole. With that in mind, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.